Hi, everyone. How are you? How did the first Native Americans in the US survive in the freezing cold? Today, I'll tell you about it through both history and storytelling. First, please take a minute to subscribe and leave a comment saying which country you're from and what time it is where you're watching. I wish you all a good night. The wind arrived before the snow.
The sun rises.
It came down from the mountains in long, merciless waves, bending the willow branches, until they scraped against the frozen ground. By sunset, the temperature had fallen so far that every breath seemed to disappear into the darkness as a cloud of white smoke. A young hunter named Nanook stood at the entrance of his family's shelter and looked toward the valley. There was almost nothing to see. Only snow. Only darkness. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the caribou herd had disappeared. His father had warned him that winter was not defeated by strength. It was defeated by preparation. A hunter could be strong and still freeze. A family could be skilled and still starve. The difference between life and death was often decided months before the first snow arrived. Nanook turned back toward the shelter. Inside, his sister Akiek was sewing. Her hands moved quickly through a piece of caribou hide, pulling sinew thread through the thick material with a bone needle. Beside her, their mother checked the seams of a pair of winter boots. Nothing in the shelter was wasted. The hide had once belonged to an animal that had fed the family. Its meat had become food. Its fat would become fuel and nourishment. Its hide would become clothing. Its sinew became thread. Even the bones had uses. This was not simply a way of living. It was a system built from generations of observation. Outside, the wind struck the shelter again. Naonoki sent it. Then he heard something beneath it. A faint sound. Footsteps. He reached for his hunting spear. A figure appeared through the snow. It was his cousin Tagri, returning alone. His face was covered with frost. His clothing was white with ice. And he was carrying nothing. Nanook opened the entrance and pulled him inside. Tagri collapsed beside the fire. The herd moved north, he whispered. His father looked at him carefully. How far? Too far to follow tonight. No one answered. There was no punish. That was one of the first lessons winter demanded. Panic wasted energy. Energy was warmth. Warmth was life. The family moved immediately. Dry clothing was brought out. Snow and ice were removed from Takri's outer garments. A lamp burning animal fat gave off a small but valuable heat. The shelter itself had been designed to protect the family from the wind. A frame of poles supported ported animal skins, while snow could be banked around the outside to add insulation. In Arctic communities, shelters as the Nunavut Ichirlik were carefully adapted to a mobile life centered around caribou. Nanook understood something that people far in the future would often forget. Survival in extreme cold was rarely about one invention. It was about hundreds of small decisions. The right clothing, the right shelter, the right food, the right place to camp, the right time to move, and above all, knowing when not to take unnecessary risks. Across the continent, other indigenous families were facing the same winter in completely different landscapes. Far to the south, where the Great Plains stretched beneath enormous skies, a young woman named White Feather was preparing for another kind of cold. Hare people had watched the herds through the warmer months. They knew the movements of the animals. They knew where water remained accessible. They knew where wood could be gathered. And they knew that a winter camp could not simply be placed anywhere. The tipi had to work with the wind. Its covering had to protect against cold. Its opening had to allow smoke to escape. A fire burned at the gentry. The shape of the structure created a space that could be adapted to winter conditions, and bison hides could provide additional warmth and bedding. Tipis were also designed for movement, an essential advantage for plains communities whose lives could involve seasonal nest travel. That evening, White Feather entered the tipi carrying a bundle of dried meat. Her younger brother was waiting. "Is that all?" She looked at him. "No." She placed the bundle beside the fire. "That is what we are eating tonight." Then she pointed toward a storage place nearby. "That is what keeps us alive tomorrow." The difference mattered. Winter survival did not depend only on finding food. It depended on storing it. Long before modern refrigeration, indigenous peoples across North America developed ways of preserving food for difficult seasons. Among Iroquoian communities, tree crops could be stored in underground pits packed with grasses and bark. Among plains peoples, archaeologists have considered the use of frozen meat caches as one possible strategy for surviving severe winters. White Feather's family had spent months preparing. Summer had been for gathering. Autumn had been for harvesting. Winter was for using what had already been secured. But in the Great Lakes forests, another family was facing the same problem from completely different world. There, an Ojibwe hunter named Misko moved silently between snow-covered trees. His snowshoes spread his weight across the surface of the snow. Without them, every step would sink deeper. With them, he could move across terrain that would otherwise become exhausting. Snowshoes had been used in North America for thousands of years and became an essential technology for winter travel in many northern regions. Their frames were commonly made from flexible wood, such as ash, with rawhide lacing providing the webbing. Misko stopped. He saw tracks. Our rabbit. He followed them. Not because one rabbit would save a village. Because winter was built from small successes. A fish. A rabbit. a handful of stored berries, dried meat, a bundle of firewood, a repaired pair of moccasins, a shelter kept dry. Each one seemed insignificant. Together, they could carry a family through months of cold. Misko reached the edge of a frozen lake. He looked across the white surface. Then he noticed something strange. Tracks crossed the snow. Not animal tracks. Human tracks. He crouched beside them. Someone had been here recently. Someone had traveling north. He followed the tracks until they disappeared beneath the trees. And then he found the first sign that something was wrong. A broken piece of wooden equipment lay in the snow. Misko picked it up. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to a hunting party. But there should have been more than one set of tracks. He looked toward the forest. The wind was rising. Night was coming. And somewhere beyond those trees, another family might already be trapped in the cold. Misko knew the rule. In winter, you did not travel simply because you wanted to. You traveled because you had a reason. You watched the weather. You watched your supplies. You watched your companions. And you watched the land. Because the land was constantly telling you what was coming. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had learned to read those signs. They knew where animals moved when deep snow arrived. They knew which plants remained available. They knew where wood could be found. They knew which materials could become waterproof clothing, insulation, rope, tools, sleds, shelters, and fuel. In Alaska, for example, caribou hides could become clothing, blankets, tents, rawhide lines, and other essential equipment. Caribou sinew could become strong thread, netting, and lashings. Nothing about this knowledge was accidental. It was accumulated. Test it. Remember it. Passed from one generation to another. And that night, as the temperature continued to fall, Nanook, White Feather, and Misko were all about to discover the same truth. The cold itself was not the only enemy. The real enemy was being unprepared when the cold changed the rules. Nanook's family had food. White Feather's family had shelter. Misko had the ability to travel through deep snow. But none of them knew what the next morning would bring. Before sunrise, the storm would become worse. One shelter would begin to fail. One hunting party would disappear. And one decision, made in the darkness before dawn, would determine whether a family survived the winter or became another silent trace beneath the snow. The first Americans had entered a continent of extraordinary climates. They did not survive because the winters were gentle. They survived because they learned to make the landscape itself part their survival. And the deeper the winter became, the more important that knowledge would become. By midnight, the wind was screaming. By morning, the world would be bereft. And when the snow finally stopped falling, someone would be missing, this storm did not end before dawn. It became stronger. Nanak woke to a sound unlike anything he had heard during the winter before. The shelter groaned beneath the pressure of the wind, and every few moments the hide covering trembled so violently that he could hear the poles shifting against one another. His father was already awake. He was kneeling beside the entrance, listening. Nanak watched him for several seconds. "Is it safer?" His father did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. The wind had changed direction during the night. The shelter had been positioned to reduce exposure to the prevailing wind, but a storm could turn even a carefully chosen camp into a dangerous place. The family could not simply leave. Outside, visibility was almost nothing, and traveling through a blizzard without a clear reason could be more dangerous than remaining where they were. Akyek added more fuel to the small lump. The flame grew brighter. Everyone knew what that meant. They would have to be careful. Animal fat was valuable. Firewood was valuable. Food was valuable. In the far north, winter survival was not a contest against cold alone. It was a constant calculation of resources. How much could be burned? How much could be eaten? How much could be carried? How much could be saved? Nanak moved toward the shelter wall and pressed his hand against the hide. Cold. But not the same cold as outside. That difference was everything. The shelter did not need to become warm like summer. It only needed to create a protected, dead space where the body could conserve enough heat to survive. His mother had taught him that years earlier. "You do not fight the wind," she had said. "You stop giving it your warmth." That lesson was written into every layer of their clothing. Caribou hide was especially valuable because the hollow structure of the hair could trap air and provide insulation. Clothing had to be designed carefully because a person who became wet in extreme cold faced a serious risk. Garments were therefore made to manage snow, moisture, wind, and body heat, rather than simply becoming as thick as possible. Nanak looked at his cousin Tagri. He had nearly died the previous evening because his clothing had become wet with snow and frost. The family had removed the moisture, protected to him from further exposure, and allowed him to recover inside the shelter. Tagri was breathing normally now. But there was another problem. They were running low on meat. The storm had prevented the hunters from reaching the animals, and the herd had already moved. Nanuk's father opened a storage container. Inside were pieces of dried meat. He counted them, then counted again. There was enough for several days, if they were careful. Not enough for weeks. The storm would decide what happened next. Far to the south, White Feather's family was facing the same uncertainty. The wind had swept across the plains during the night, pushing snow against the tepee walls. Her father woke, before sunrise and checked the entrance. The smoke hole had to remain functional. A fire burning inside a teepee needed ventilation, and the opening could be adjusted according to wind and weather. Too much smoke was dangerous. Too much open space allowed valuable heat to escape. White Feather watched as her father adjusted the opening. The fire continued burning. She pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the world had disappeared. There was no visible horizon, only white. Her younger brother whispered, "Will the buffalo come back?" White Feather looked toward the entrance. She wanted to say yes. Instead, she said, "We will find them." It was not a promise that the animals would return. It was a promise that they would continue looking. That distinction mattered. Plains peoples depended heavily on bison in many regions, but winter hunting required knowledge of animal behavior, snow conditions, terrain, and the movement of herds. A successful hunt could provide meat, fat, hides, sinew, and other materials. The animal could become food. Its hide could become clothing. Its bones could become tools. Its sinew could become cordage. The same principle existed across many indigenous societies. An animal was not simply a source of meat. It was a source of materials. And every part that could be used reduced the need to find something else. White Feather's father checked their remaining stories. Then he made a decision. They would not hunt that morning. They would wait. Her brother looked surprised. "But we need food." "We need food," her father said, "and we need hunters who can return." A winter hunt was not successful if the hunters never came home. That was another principle repeated across generations. Survival required restraint. Sometimes the bravest decision was to remain inside. In the forest country farther east, Misko was making the opposite choice. He had found the broken hunting equipment beneath the snow. Now he was following the tracks. He knew he should return. The storm was approaching. But he also knew the tracks were fresh. Samuna had traveled north. Perhaps an injured hunter. Perhaps a family searching for shelter. He tightened the bindings of his snowshoes. Then he began walking. Each step compressed the snow beneath him. The snowshoes spread his weight across a larger area, allowing him to move more efficiently over deep snow. But snowshoes did not make winter easy. They simply made movement possible. Misko moved between trees, stopping frequently. "Hey, listen it." The forest was quieter than normal. Then he saw smoke, a thin gray line rising between the trees. He stopped. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. He moved closer. There was a small winter shelter beneath the trees. Its entrance was partly covered with branches. Misko called out. No answer. He called again. This time he heard something. a child crying. Misko approached carefully. Inside, he found 3 people. An older man, a woman, and a boy. The man was injured. His leg was wrapped in hide. Their supplies were nearly gone. The woman looked at Misko. We thought no one would find us. Misko looked at outside. The storm was getting closer. Jan, you walk. The man shook his head. Misko understood the problem immediately. He could not simply tell them to follow him. He would have to help them move. The woman gathered what little food remained. The boy carried a small bandolier. Misko looked at the shelter, then at the approaching clouds. They had very little time. He knew another lesson of winter. A good shelter was often worth more than a long journey. If they could strengthen the existing shelter, they might survive the storm. If they left at the wrong moment, they could lose everything. Misko crouched beside the entrance. He examined the direction of the wind. Then he began gathering branches. The woman understood. She joined him. Together they reinforced the shelter. Snow was packed around exposed areas. The entrance was narrowed. The interior was reorganized so that the people could stay close together. They were not trying to make the shelter comfortable. They were trying to make it survivable. As evening approached, the storm arrived. The trees disappeared behind a wall of snow. Misko sat beside the fire. The injured man slept. The child was wrapped in layers of clothing. The woman watched the flames. For a long time, no one spoke. Then she asked, "How did you know where to find us?" Misko looked toward the entrance. "I followed your tracks." The woman smiled faintly. "Tomorrow they will be gone." Misko noted, "10 tomorrow, we make new ones." Far north, Nanook heard the same storm. The shelter shook again. His father looked at him. "We cannot stay here forever." Nanook understood what he meant. The storm would eventually pass. But when it did, the caribou would still be somewhere beyond the ridge. They would need to find them. He began preparing his equipment. His clothing was checked carefully. The seams were examined. The bindings were tightened. His boots were inspected. His hunting tools were secured. Nothing was left to chance. Akiak watched him. "You are going tomorrow?" "If the storm stops." "And if it doesn't?" Nanook looked at the doorway. "Then we wait." She nodded. Outside, the wind continued. Inside, the family waited. This was one of the hidden skills of surviving extreme environments. Knowing when to act was important. Knowing when to wait could be even more important. For generations, indigenous peoples had learned their environments through observation, memory, and experience. They knew that winter was not a single go condition. Snow changed Ice changed. Animals changed their routes. Rivers froze and thawed. Winds shifted. Food availability changed. The landscape was never still. The people had to change with it. That night, Nanook dreamed of the caribou. He saw thousands of animals moving across a white valley. He heard their hooves striking frozen ground. Then the herd stopped. Every animal turned in the same direction. Toward the mountains. Nanak woke Sudeni. The shelter was dark. The fire had burned low. Haley Sinet. Something had changed. The wind was quieter. He crawled toward the entrance and lifted the covering slightly. The storm had stopped. The world outside was silent. Snow covered everything. The sky was beginning to brighten. Nanook stepped outside the cold struck his face immediately. But the air was still. He looked toward the ridge. Then he saw them. Tracks. Hundreds of them. Jarabo tracks. The herd had passed it during the storm. They were moving toward the mountains. Nanak stared at the tracks. Then he noticed something else. One set of tracks, separated from the herd. A smaller animal. It had turned toward the valley. And beside those tracks were human footprints. Nanu crouched. He recognized them. They were not his family's. Someone had been following the herd. Someone else knew where the animals had gone. He stood slowly. Behind him, his father came out of the shelter. What did you find? Nanak pointed toward the tracks. His father studied them. Then his expression changed. Pack what we can carry. Nanak looked at him. Who are they? His father did not answer. He was looking toward the mountains. The footprints were fresh, and they were heading in the same direction as the caribou. The family had survived the storm, but the winter had just revealed a new problem. They were no longer the only hunters searching for the herd. And somewhere beyond the ridge, another group was already moving through the snow. By sunset, Nanook would have to decide whether to follow them. And if he did, he might discover that the greatest danger of the winter was not the cold at all. It was what waited beyond the mountains. Nanook did not move. For several breaths, he simply stared at the footprints disappearing toward the mountains. His father studied them again. They are fresh, he said. How many? At least 3. Nanook looked toward the distant reach. The caribou tracks continued in the same direction. His father gathered the family's hunting equipment. We follow the heart. Nanook hesitated. And the people. His father looked at him. We do not know who they are. That was enough. They would follow carefully. The family packed only what was necessary. Food was divided into small portions. The hunting tools were secured. A small amount of fuel was carried for emergencies. Everything else remained behind. This was another lesson of winter travel. The farther you travel it, the more every unnecessary object became a burden. Nanook stepped into the snow. The cold was sharper than before. The storm had left a hard crust over the surface, but underneath it was loose snow. He moved slowly. His father followed. Akyak remained behind with their mother. The journey had begun. For the first hour, they followed the caribou. The tracks were easy to recognize. A large herd had passed through the valley. The animals had been moving steadily. They were searching for food. Caribou could survive severe northern winters partly because of their ability to travel long distances and exploit seasonal food resources. Their diet could include lichens and other vegetation available beneath or above snow, although deep or crusted snow could make feeding more difficult. Nanook knew this. The herd would not stop simply because humans were following. The animals were moving toward better feeding grounds. The hunters had to move with them. By midday, Nanook noticed something strange. The human tracks had disappeared. His father stopped. They searched the snow. Nothing. Then Nanook saw a broken branch. He looked up. The tracks had crossed out onto harder ground between the trees. The other hunters had deliberately avoided it, leaving an obvious trail. Nanook's father smiled faintly. They know the land. Nanook looked at him. Aren't they hunting us? No. Then why hide their tracks? Because they are hunting the caribou. Nanook understood. The winter had brought them into competition, not necessarily conflict. Competition. A herd could feed several families, but a failed hunt could leave everyone with less. That was why hunters needed discipline. A missed opportunity could matter. A wounded animal could be lost. A dangerous pursuit could cost a hunter his life. The farther they climbed, the colder the air became. Nanook's fingers began to uke. His father noticed. Cover them. Nanook pulled the fur covering farther over his hands. Cold injury often began without dramatic warning. Numbness could make a person careless. A person might not realize how cold their skin had become until the damage was already serious. The lesson was simply, do not wait until you are freezing to protect yourself. Protect yourself before you are cold. They continued. Then they found blood. A small amount. Fresh. Nanook crouched. Jeribo. His father touched the snow. Yes. They followed the trail. It led toward a narrow valley. At the end of the valley, they heard movement. Nanook lowered himself. There. Between the rocks. A jeribou. Separated from the herd. It was injured. One of the other hunters had already wounded it. Nanuk's father raised his hand. They waited. The animal moved slowly. The hunters did not rush. A wounded animal could still be dangerous. More importantly, a poorly planned approach could it to run. Nanuk waited for his father's signal. Then they moved. The hunt was quick. When it was over, they stood silently beside the animal. There was no celebration. There was work. The animal had become food, clothing material, and useful raw material. They had to process it carefully. In a cold environment, time mattered. Meat could freeze rapidly. The hide needed to be handled properly. Useful materials had to be protected. Nothing important could simply be left behind. Nanuk looked toward the ridge. The other hunters were watching. For a moment, neither group moved. Then one of the strangers stepped forward. He was carrying a spear. Nanuk's hand moved toward his own weapon. His father stopped him. The stranger spoke first. "We saw the heart." Nanuk's father nodded. "So did we." The stranger looked at the caribou. "You have enough." His father looked at the animal, then at the three hunters. "Do you?" The stranger did not answer. The silence lasted several seconds. Then he lowered his weapon. "We have not eaten since yesterday." Nanuk's father divided the meat. "Not all of it, but enough." Nanuk watched carefully. His father had taught him that survival was not only about taking. It was also about maintaining relationships. In small communities, living in difficult environments, cooperation could be essential. Sharing did not mean having unlimited resources. It meant recognizing that survival could depend on people helping one another when circumstances demanded it. The strangers accepted the meat. One of them pointed toward the valley. "More animals are coming." Nanuk's father looked at him. "How do you know?" The hunter pointed toward the snow. "Fresh tracks." The herd had not finished moving. They had only seen a small part of it. The hunters separated. There was no need to remain together. Each group would take its own path. Nanuk watched the strangers disappear between the rocks. Then he looked at his father. Was that the right choice? His father answered quietly. "We all need to survive the winter." They returned to camp before darkness. Akiek had already prepared the shelter. Their mother had cleared snow from the entrance. The meat was brought inside. That evening, the family ate not a feast, a measured meal. The meat was divided carefully. Some would be eaten. Some would be preserved. Some would become part of the next day's journey. The storm had changed everything. But the family had gained something more valuable than one successful hunt. They had bought time. and in winter, time could be as important as food. Far away, Misko was facing a different problem. The storm had ended, but the injured man could still not walk. The small shelter had survived. The fire had survived. Their food had not. Misko examined the remaining supplies. There was enough for perhaps another day. Maybe two. He looked at the woman. "We have to move it." She nodded. The injured man tried to stand. His face tightened with pain. Misko helped him. He could put weight on the leg. Barley. They would move slowly. The woman packed their belongings. The boy gathered the remaining firewood. They left the shelter shortly after sunrise. Misko traveled ahead. The boy followed. The injured man moved between Misko and the woman. They did not travel quickly. They traveled safely. That difference mattered. The snow-covered forest could conceal hazards. Teenasia. Hidden branches. Steep slopes. Frozen waterways. A person who moved too quickly could become exhausted or injured. And exhaustion in winter was dangerous. Misko stopped frequently. He checked the route. He watched the sky. He examined the snow. At midday, the group reached a frozen lake. Misko stopped again. The boy looked at him. "Jump across." Misko looked across the ice. He did not answer immediately. Frozen water was never simply safe because the surface looked solid. Ice thickness could vary. Inlets, outlets, springs, currents, and areas of moving water could create weak spots. Misko walked along the shoreline instead. The longer route would take more time. But winter survival was not about choosing the shortest path. It was about choosing the path that gave you the best chance of reaching the other side alive. They went around. By late afternoon, they reached another camp. Smoke rose from several shelters. People emerged. The woman recognized them. Relief crossed her face. Her family had been found. Misko stepped back. He had done what he came to do. The injured man reached for his hand. "Thank you." Misko nodded. Then he looked toward the trees. The sun was already falling. He needed to return. But before he left, the older monk called him back. "You followed the tracks." Misko turned it. The man pointed toward the north. "There are more people traveling in that way." Misko's expression changed. "How many?" "We do not know." "Why are they moving?" The old man shook his head. "Because something has changed." Misko looked toward the distant forest. Winter had been difficult. Now it was becoming unpredictable. That night, Misko returned to his own camp. His family was waiting. They had food. They had fire. They had shelter. But they also had a message. Other groups were moving. Animals were moving. The winter landscape was changing. Misko sat beside the fire and listened to the older people speak. One of them remembered winters when the snow came early. Another remembered a winter when the animals changed their routes. Another remembered it a season when ice formed late. Knowledge like this was not written on maps. It lived in memory. It was carried in stories. It was taught through experience. A child learned where to step. A young hunter learned how to read tracks. An experienced traveler learned how to read weather. An elder remembered what happened when people ignored the signs. This was one reason indigenous survival knowledge could be so sophisticated. It was not a collection of tricks. It was an entire understanding of relationships between people, animals, weather, plants, water, and land. Far north, Nanook was sleeping when his father woke him. "Get up." Nanook opened his eyes. "What happened?" "Listen." "Hey, listen it." At first, he heard nothing. Then it came. Hovis dance sound. Hovis. The caribou were moving again. The herd was passing near the camp. Nanook stood. His father handed him his clothing. Within minutes, the family was preparing to move. But before they left, Akiek looked toward the eastern sky. A faint light had appeared. The winter sun was returning. Not enough to bring warmth. Not enough to end the cold. But enough to remind them that winter was not eternal. They stepped outside. The horizon was beginning to glow. Nanook looked at the mountains. For the first time in weeks, he could see their full shape. The snow-covered peaks rose above the valley. Beautiful. Silant. Dangerous. Then he noticed something on the ridge. A dark figure. Someone was standing there, watching them. Nanook raised his hand. His father turned. The figure did not move. Then another appeared. And another. 3 hunters. The same people they had met the previous day. But they were not watching the family. They were watching something behind them. Nanook slowly turned it. Far across the valley, a huge movement was spreading through the snow. The main caribou herd had arrived. Hundreds of animals were moving together. The hunters had found what they had been searching for. But there was a problem. The herd was moving directly toward a frozen river. And the river was not completely frozen. Nanook's father saw it too. He grabbed his son's arm. "Stop." The hunters on the ridge began shouting. The herd continued forward. The leading animals reached the river. The ice cracked. One animal fell. Then another. The entire herd began turning. Panic spread through the animals. Nanook watched helplessly. If the herd scattered, the hunters could lose the food they needed for the winter. If they rushed forward, someone could fall through the ice. His father looked at the other hunters, then at Nanook. For a moment, nobody moved. The decision that followed it would not only determine how much food they obtained, it would determine whether anyone survived the hunt. And beneath the snow, hidden by ice and darkness, the river was already beginning to open. The ice cracked again. Nanook heard it before he saw it. A deep sound moved beneath the frozen river, like distant thunder trapped under the snow. The caribou stopped. For a moment, hundreds of animals stood together on the white bank. Then the leaders turned. The herd began moving away from the dangerous crossing. Nanook's father lowered his weapon. Wait. The other hunters understood. No one chased the animals toward the thin ice. They watched. The caribou moved along the river until they found a safer crossing farther upstream. The hunters followed from a distance. Hours later, the herd reached solid ground. Only then did the hunt begin. It was not a battle against the animals. It was a carefully planned effort to take what the families needed while avoiding unnecessary danger. When the hunt was over, the work continued. Meat was divided. Useful materials were collected. Nothing that could help the families through the remaining winter was casually discarded. Nanook worked it until his hands were tired. For the first time, he understood what his father had meant months earlier. Winter was not defeated by one successful hunt. It was survived through preparation, repeated every day. That evening, the hunters returned to camp. The families shared what had been brought back. There was enough food now, not enough to waste it, not enough to celebrate without thought, but enough to make the remaining weeks less dangerous. Akiak prepared the meat. Their mother repaired clothing. Nanook's father checked at the shelter. Everyone had a task, and every task mattered. Far away, Misako was also preparing for the final stretch of winter. The forest was beginning to change. The days were becoming longer. The snow still covered the ground, but sunlight remained in the sky for more time each afternoon. Misko walked through the trees and checked his traps. Some had produced food. Others had not. He accepted both outcomes. A hunter could prepare carefully and still fail. The important thing was to continue. Near the frozen lake, he stopped. The ice was beginning to change. He remembered the injured traveler from earlier in the winter. He remembered the decision to walk around the lake instead of crossing it. That choice had added hours to their journey. But everyone had survived. Misko smiled. The shortest route was not always the best route. Sometimes survival meant choosing patience over speed. In the plains, White Feather was watching the sky. Winter had weakened it. Her family had used much of their stored food. The last weeks had been difficult, but the stores had done what they were meant to do. They had carried the family through a period when fresh food was less predictable. Her father stepped outside. He looked toward the horizon. Listen. White Feather listened. At first, she heard only wind, then birds. The sound was faint, but it was enough. Spring was approaching. Not all at once. The snow would remain. The nights would still be cold. Some storms would return. But the season was turning. White Feather looked at her younger brother. He had grown during the winter. His clothing was worn. His boots had been repaired several times. His hands had become more capable. He had learned how to carry wood, how to protect the fire, how to recognize the dangerous weather, how to respect the cold, and perhaps, most importantly, he had learned that survival was not something a person accomplished alone. It was something a community practiced together. Weeks later, the snow finally began to retreat. The rivers remained dangerous. The ground was wet. The forests were still cold. But life was returning. Nanook stood beside the valley where the caribou had passed. He looked at the mountains. The tracks that had seemed endless in winter were disappearing. Water ran beneath the snow. Birds returned. The days grew longer. His father stood beside him. "You will remember this winter." Nanak nodded. "What will I remember?" His father looked across the valley. "The cold." Nanook thought about it, then shook his head. "No." His father looked at him. "The people." His father smiled. That was the lesson. The people survived because they knew the land. They understood the animals. They built shelters suited to their environments. They created clothing from available materials. They preserved food. They used fire carefully. They developed technologies that made winter travel possible. They moved when movement was necessary. They stayed when staying was safer. And they passed knowledge from one generation to the next. There was no single method used by all indigenous peoples. North America contained enormous differences in climate and geography. The Arctic required different solutions from the Great Plains. The forests required different solutions from the deserts. Coastal communities faced different challenges from inland communities. But across these environments, indigenous societies developed sophisticated knowledge of local conditions. They learned how to work with their surroundings rather than expecting the environment to become easier. For Nanook, winter meant understanding snow, wind, caribou, clothing, shelter, and distance. For Misko, it meant understanding forests, ash, snowshoes, animals, and safe travel. For White Feather, it meant understanding the movement of herds, stored food, shelter, weather, and community. Their worlds were different. Their solutions were different. But one principle connected them: preparation. The cold did not care whether someone was strong. It did not care whether someone it was brave. It did not care whether someone had survived the previous winter. A person who ignored the environment could still die. A person who respected it had a chance. That knowledge was not created in one generation. It was accumulated over thousands of years. Every successful winter taught something. Every mistake taught something else. A broken shelter taught where to strengthen the frame. A failed hunt taught when to wait. A dangerous river crossing taught where ice could not be trusted. A hungry season taught how much food needed to be stored. A child who learned how to sew warm clothing became an adult who could teach another child. And slowly, across generations, survival knowledge became culture. The winter ended, but the knowledge remained. Years later, Nanook would become the experienced hunter. Akiak would teach younger people how to work hide and sinew. Misko would remember the frozen lake. White Feather would remember the winter when the food stores almost ran out. And the children who listened to their stories would carry those lessons into winters that none of them could yet imagine, because that was how people survived the cold. Not through one secret, not through one miraculous invention, but through thousands of observations, thousands of careful decisions, and generations of people who understood that the land was not something to conquer. It was something to learn. When the next winter came, the snow would fall again. The rivers would freeze. The wind would return. The nights would become long. And somewhere, beneath the northern sky, another family would light a fire. They would check their clothing. They would inspect their shelter. They would count their food. They would listen to the wind. And before stepping into the darkness, an elder would tell a child what generations had already learned. The cold can be survived, but only if you respect it. And outside, beneath a sky filled with stars, the fire would continue burning. The people would remain together. The winter would pass, and a story would become part of the knowledge carried into the next generation. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment.